My name is Gwen Sullivan. When my son told me to stop playing the victim, something inside me finally shattered. It happened at my granddaughter Emily's 16th birthday party. The house was filled with family, laughter, and decorations. That was when I made the mistake of bringing up my late husband, Michael. Ethan slammed his glass onto the table. He told me that my husband spent his whole life cleaning up my messes, and that even now, 12 years after his passing, I was still playing the victim. The room went completely silent. No one defended me. No one questioned him. They looked at me as if I really was the person he claimed. For 12 years, I had guarded a dead man's secrets and carried the blame for things I never did. That night, looking around the dinner table, I made a choice. I told him calmly that if he wanted the truth, he was finally going to hear all of it. If you have ever been misunderstood by the people you love most, I would love to hear your story. Before we continue, if stories like this resonate with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you would do if your own child spoke to you that way, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment. I wasn't always the person my son accused me of being. Once, I was just Gwen Sullivan, a young woman driving a used car, living in a modest apartment in Columbus, Ohio, with big plans for the future. Michael Sullivan was at the center of all those plans. I met him when I was 24. I still remember the first day I saw him. I was working as a receptionist at a small accounting firm. He walked in carrying a box of files, wearing the most confident smile I had ever seen. Everyone loved Michael. In less than 10 minutes, he knew everyone's name. In less than an hour, he had the whole office laughing. Within a week, he asked me out. Looking back, I understand why people trusted him so easily. Michael had a gift. He knew how to make you feel special, like you were the only person in the room. When he listened, you believed every word you said mattered. When he loved you, it felt as warm as sunlight. At least, it did in the beginning. We married 2 years later. The early years were genuinely happy. We bought a small house with peeling paint and an overgrown front yard. Neither of us had much money, but we had dreams. We spent weekends working on the house, eating cheap takeout on the living room floor because we couldn't afford furniture yet. We were always laughing. Most of all, we wanted a family. When Ethan was born, Michael cried harder than I did. I can still see him standing by my hospital bed, holding our tiny son, whispering that he would give him everything he never had. For many years I believed he would. Michael adored Ethan. He coached Little League, attended school events, and helped with science projects. Whenever Ethan needed him, Michael was there. To the outside world, he was the perfect father, the perfect husband, the perfect man. That image was so powerful that even after his death, no one questioned it, including our son. For a long time, I didn't question it either, at least not openly. The first sign that something was wrong seemed so minor I almost ignored it. One night around our 8th year of marriage, I was balancing our checkbook. Money had always been tight, so I tracked every dollar, every bill, and every grocery receipt. I noticed an unexplained withdrawal of $300. It wasn't enough to cause panic, but enough to be confusing. When Michael came home, I asked him about it. He brushed it off casually, saying he had lent some money to a co-worker. I accepted the explanation immediately. That was what trust looked like back then. A few months later, the same thing happened, but for $500. Again, he had an explanation. A friend needed help. A car repair, an emergency, a temporary setback. I believed him again. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, the man who kissed me goodbye every morning, tucked our son into bed every night, and whom everyone admired. But over the next few years, it became harder to explain the missing money. Small amounts turned into large ones. Unexpected withdrawals became frequent, and credit card balances began to climb. Sometimes I asked questions. Sometimes Michael became defensive, not angry, just impatient, as if my concerns were unreasonable. He would always say he would handle it. That became his favorite phrase. At first, I wanted to believe him. Later, I needed to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying. The alternative meant something was happening inside our marriage that I didn't understand. One night after Ethan was asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a pile of unpaid bills. The numbers simply didn't add up. No matter how many times I checked, the money we earned should have been enough. We should have been comfortable. Instead, we were constantly struggling. Michael walked into the kitchen carrying a beer. Seeing the paperwork spread across the table, his smile faded. He asked what was wrong, and I remember those words because they stung. Not because he shouted, but because he sounded exhausted by my questions, as if I were the problem. I showed him the bills, the balances, and the growing debt. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sat down and rubbed his forehead. It was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not annoyance, but fear. He admitted he had made some mistakes. I felt my heart sink. Mistakes. The word sounded much heavier than unpaid bills. When I asked what kind of mistakes, Michael looked away. The silence that followed felt endless. Even now, decades later, I can still hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock above the stove, and the sound of my own heart racing. Finally, he looked at me and said they were temporary problems he could fix, but he didn't truly answer my question. That was the moment something shifted inside me. For the first time in our marriage, I realized there were parts of Michael's life I couldn't see, parts he didn't want me to see. The realization frightened me, but it also awakened a quiet suspicion. Over the next few months, I began to pay closer attention. I noticed phone calls that ended the moment I walked into the room, missing receipts, and late nights he couldn't fully explain. Every time I pressed for answers, Michael became more skilled at changing the subject. Sometimes he apologized, sometimes he promised things would get better, and sometimes he held my hand and told me I was worrying too much. The worst part was that I wanted to believe him, because believing him was much easier than facing the truth. Meanwhile, Ethan was growing into a wonderful boy. He excelled in school, loved baseball, and idolized his father. Every time I watched them together, I convinced myself that maintaining peace in our home was more important than asking difficult questions. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake, not a lack of trust or love, but choosing silence when I should have demanded honesty. Years later, that silence would cost me more than I could have imagined. It would cost me my reputation, my relationship with my son, and nearly my entire family. But at the time, I knew none of this. I only knew the man I loved was hiding something serious and dangerous. Despite his promises, the problems weren't getting smaller. They were growing larger and faster. One rainy afternoon, while organizing papers Michael had left on his desk, I found an envelope he had forgotten to hide. Inside was a statement from a lending institution. Before I even finished reading it, my hands began to shake. The balance was far beyond anything I had imagined, well past what our family could easily repay. At the bottom of the page was a recent date. This meant it wasn't old debt. It was new, very new. I sat there staring at the numbers, feeling as if the floor had vanished beneath me. When Michael came home that night, I knew our lives would change forever. For the first time, I finally had undeniable proof that what was happening was no longer just a mistake. It was a secret, and it was much larger than anything I had feared. That night, I waited for Michael with a heavy heart. For years I had accepted his explanations and chosen trust over suspicion. But that piece of paper changed everything. The loan balance wasn't a few $1,000s, it was tens of thousands. There was no longer a reasonable explanation. It wasn't a forgotten bill, a temporary setback, or helping a friend. When Michael finally walked through the front door, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the statement in front of me. He saw it instantly, and the colour drained from his face. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. That silence told me more than any words could. He finally asked if I had gone through his desk. I stared at him. That was his first concern. Not the debt or the lies, but that I had discovered it. When I asked him to tell me what it was, his shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight. Then he sat down across from me, keeping his eyes fixed on the table, and admitted it was sports betting. I blinked in disbelief. Sports betting. The words sounded completely unreal. Michael wasn't a reckless stranger. He was a father, a husband, and a respected member of the community who coached Little League and volunteered at church fundraisers. A man like Michael wasn't supposed to have a gambling problem. At least that was what I thought at the time. He told me it started small, just for fun. I felt a wave of nausea because every terrible story begins with those words. Just for fun. Michael explained that a co-worker had introduced him to sports betting a few years prior. At first, he won a few $100s here and there. Winning felt easy, exciting, and harmless. Then he began to lose. Every time he lost, he believed he could win it back with just one more bet, one more game, or one more weekend. I listened in absolute shock as everything suddenly made sense. The missing money, the secret withdrawals, the growing debt, the strange phone calls, and the tension whenever finances were mentioned. All of it. Yet I still couldn't fully process what I was hearing. When I quietly asked how much, Michael hesitated before telling me a number that nearly stopped my heart. I felt my hands turn ice cold. The debt was greater than our savings, far beyond what we could easily repay, and completely past my worst fears. I remember standing up from the table because I couldn't sit still any longer. The room felt too small, as if the walls were closing in on me. I whispered, asking how he could do this to us. To this day, I still remember the look in his eyes. Genuine shame, but also desperation. He kept repeating that he could fix it and would handle everything. I wanted to scream, but instead, I cried. It wasn't just because of the money, but because of the betrayal. The money was terrifying, but the lies were worse. For years, Michael had looked into my eyes and promised everything was fine. He watched me work overtime, count pennies, and sacrifice small luxuries for our family, all while hiding the truth. That night became one of the longest of my life. We argued until nearly dawn. I asked hundreds of questions, and each answer was more painful than the last. By sunrise, I learned something else that frightened me even more. Michael had tried to stop gambling several times before. He could no longer control it. The gambling was controlling him. This realization changed everything. The anger remained, but it was suddenly mixed with fear because I was no longer just dealing with poor choices. I was dealing with an addiction. The months that followed became a cycle I wouldn't wish on anyone. Michael would promise to stop, and for a while, he did. Things would improve, our finances would stabilize, and hope would return. Then something would always happen. A football game, a basketball season, or a sure thing. Suddenly we would be right back at the beginning. Each setback was more destructive than the last. The debt grew heavier, and my trust grew weaker. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was watching two different versions of Michael exist at the same time. There was the Michael everyone knew, the charming father, devoted husband, and reliable friend. Then there was the man I saw behind closed doors, the one anxiously checking scores late at night, fearfully hiding statements, and desperately trying to recover his losses. Both men lived in the same body, and I never knew which one I would see on any given day. Meanwhile, Ethan remained happily unaware. He was in high school at the time, smart, kind, and hard-working. He idolized his father. Whenever Michael went to his baseball games, Ethan's eyes would light up. Whenever Michael praised him, he would stand a little taller. Watching them together broke my heart because I knew Ethan only saw the best version of his father, the version that was still real, but wasn't the whole truth. Several times I considered telling him, not everything, but just enough to prepare him, to explain why money was tight and why I always looked exhausted. But every time I came close to saying it, I stopped because Michael would beg me not to let Ethan see him that way. Each time, I gave in. It wasn't because Michael deserved protection, but because Ethan deserved peace. At least, that was the reason I gave myself. Looking back, I don't know if I made the wrong choice. Perhaps honesty could have prevented years of pain, or perhaps not. I will never know. As the years passed, I became the person holding everything together. I worked overtime, managed every bill, negotiated repayment plans, and refinanced debts. I learned more about financial survival than I ever wanted to know. Sometimes I felt less like a wife and more like a crisis manager. Many nights after everyone else was asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at spreadsheets and numbers until my eyes ached, trying to find a way to save our family, keep our house, and ensure Ethan could still go to college someday. On those nights, Michael would often come downstairs, wrap his arms around me, tell me he was sorry, and promise things would change. Sometimes I believed him because, despite everything, I still loved him. Love doesn't fade as quickly as trust. That is one of the cruelest truths I have learned. Then one afternoon, everything became much worse. I received a phone call while at work. The voice on the line identified himself as a loan officer. At first I thought it was a mistake. Then he mentioned Michael's name, and my heart sank. The officer explained that several payments had been missed. Not one or two, but multiple payments. He warned that if the situation wasn't resolved, legal action could follow. I sat frozen at my desk. After hanging up, I locked myself in the restroom and cried because I finally understood that the problem was much larger than Michael had ever admitted. That night, I confronted him again, and this time he couldn't deny it. He confessed he had taken out another loan, then another, and another. Some were secured, some unsecured, and some I had never even heard of. I felt my entire marriage collapsing around me. But the worst revelation came moments later, when he muttered that there was one more thing. The moment those words left his mouth, I knew my life was about to change again. Whenever someone says there is one more thing, it is always worse. I looked at my husband, the father of my child, the man I had loved for nearly 20 years. For the first time in my life, I was terrified of what he was about to tell me. Long after Michael said those words, they continued to echo in my mind. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, bracing myself for whatever was next. A part of me hoped things couldn't possibly get worse, but I was wrong. Michael swallowed hard and looked down at his hands, admitting he had borrowed money from family. For a second I didn't understand. Then it clicked, and somehow this hurt more than anything else. When I asked from whom, he revealed it was his sister, Linda. Even then, hearing her name made me uneasy. Michael's sister had always been a complicated person. She was charming when she wanted something, and warm when people were watching. But beneath that perfect smile was someone who kept score of everything, every favor, every slight, and every advantage. Over the years, I had learned to keep my distance. It wasn't because we had open disagreements, but because I never fully trusted her. When I asked how much, his hesitation gave away the answer before he even spoke. It was too much, far too much. When he finally revealed the amount, I felt physically ill. Over the past few years, Linda had lent him a significant sum of money. It wasn't all at once, but bit by bit, whenever Michael was in trouble, whenever creditors called, or whenever another bad bet turned into a disaster. Linda had stepped in, at least that was how Michael described it. Suddenly, I understood why Linda had become increasingly involved in our lives, why she always seemed to know more about our finances than she should, and why she occasionally gave me strange looks during family gatherings. She knew, she had known for years, and she had never told me. The sense of betrayal was immense. I asked if she knew about the gambling, and Michael nodded. I closed my eyes. Of course she knew. How could she not? No one repeatedly lends that much money without asking why. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The marriage I thought I had was falling apart piece by piece. Every answer revealed a new lie, and every secret exposed another hidden layer. Yet I was still expected to keep going, pay the bills, raise Ethan, and pretend everything was normal. Finally, I stood up. I needed air. I walked outside and sat alone on our backyard porch. The night air felt cold against my skin. Inside, the lights shone through the windows. From the outside, we looked like any ordinary family, a husband, a wife, a teenage son, in a warm home with nothing amiss, no cracks in the foundation. But appearances can be deeply deceiving. That became one of the most important lessons of my life. Over the next few years, I learned how exhausting it is to live with secrets, not just keeping them, but carrying them, managing them and protecting them. Michael did truly try to recover, to be fair. He attended counselling, joined support groups, and sometimes went months or even longer without gambling. There were times I believed the worst days were behind us, times when life felt almost normal again. But addiction has a cruel way of hiding in the shadows. waiting patiently and quietly before returning unexpectedly. Each setback caused fresh damage, sometimes financially, sometimes emotionally, and usually both. Each one required a new round of crisis control. By then, Ethan was in college, a bright young man with big dreams. Watching him leave for college was one of the proudest moments of my life. After we dropped him off, I cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from pride. Despite everything happening behind the scenes, he had grown into an outstanding young man, responsible, kind, and driven. I wanted him to stay that way. I wanted him to focus on building his future, not on cleaning up his father's mistakes. That was why I never told him. People often ask why I remained silent. The answer isn't simple. Part of it was love, part of it shame, and part of it fear. But the biggest reason was Ethan. I didn't want the image of his father to be ruined. Perhaps that sounds foolish, but when you are a mother, protecting your child often becomes an instinct, even if it hurts you, even if it costs you. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. Ethan deserved to have at least one parent he could admire completely, so I carried the burden year after year. Later, Michael's health began to change. At first, it was minor: fatigue, shortness of breath, and occasional chest discomfort. Nothing dramatic or immediately alarming, but gradually the symptoms worsened. The doctor recommended tests, followed by more appointments and specialists. I could see fear growing in Michael. Not fear of debt or creditors, but a deeper fear that time was running out. Around the same time, something else shifted. Michael became quieter and more reflective. Sometimes I would see him staring out the window for long periods, lost in his thoughts, as if reviewing his life, counting regrets, and weighing consequences. One night after dinner, he sat across from me at the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had taken place. His face looked much older than I remembered, exhausted and worn down. He told me quietly that there was something I needed to know. I immediately felt tense, because conversations like that rarely ended well. But this time was different. This time, there were no excuses, no promises, and no attempts to minimize the damage. Just honesty, or at least the closest thing to honesty I had seen in years. Michael admitted he knew how much pain he had caused, how much I had sacrificed, and that most of our lives had been spent cleaning up his disasters. As he spoke, his eyes filled with tears. Despite everything that had happened, seeing him cry still hurt because I remembered who he was before all of this. The young man who walked into my office carrying a box. The man who held our newborn son in the hospital. And the husband I had trusted completely. That man hadn't vanished entirely. He was buried beneath years of mistakes, but he wasn't completely gone. He whispered that he didn't deserve me. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to agree. A part wanted to forgive him, and a part wanted to scream. Instead, I just sat there listening, watching, and waiting. Then he said something I will never forget. He asked me to promise that if anything happened to him, Ethan wouldn't hate him. I stared at him, shocked by the request. He begged me through his tears. The room was unbearably quiet because, deep down, I knew exactly what he was asking. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for protection. He wanted me to maintain Ethan's image of him even after he was gone, even if it meant carrying the blame alone and keeping the secret forever. I didn't answer at the time because I couldn't. The request felt too heavy, too unfair, and too impossible. But life has a strange way of making choices for us. A little over a year later, Michael suffered a severe heart attack. The call came in the early morning. I remember the coffee cup dropping from my hand when the phone rang, driving to the hospital with shaking hands, praying the entire way, and the look on Ethan's face when he arrived. Pure terror. The kind only a child feels when facing the loss of a parent. For days, we stayed in the hospital waiting room. Machines beeped. Doctors spoke in cautious tones, and hope appeared, vanished, and reappeared until finally there was no hope left. 12 years before my son called me a victim at that birthday party, Michael Sullivan passed away. When we buried him, everyone wept for a good man, a loving father, and a devoted husband. A man who buried his mistakes deep in the ground forever. I stood by his grave carrying every secret, every debt, every sacrifice, and every lie. After the funeral, while people were still embracing and wiping away tears, someone approached me with a strange expression. It was Linda, Michael's sister. She leaned in close, ensuring no one else could hear, and whispered a sentence that would alter the next 12 years of my life. After Michael's funeral, I thought the hardest part of my life would be learning how to live without him. I was wrong. The hardest part was facing what came next. When Linda approached me, the cemetery was nearly empty. Most of the guests had left, leaving only close family. I was emotionally exhausted. My husband had been buried less than an hour prior. My son was devastated, and I was still trying to figure out how I was going to survive financially. Linda stepped up beside me, her voice initially sounding full of sympathy, almost gentle, as she warned me to be careful. I looked at her, asking about what. She glanced at Ethan, who was standing a few yards away, talking to friends, lowered her voice, and told me to be careful about what he might find out. My heart tightened instantly. The comment felt strange, threatening, and deliberate. I remember staring at her without saying a word. Linda smiled slightly, a smile that never reached her eyes, and walked away. At the time, I convinced myself that grief was making me overly sensitive. I wanted peace, not conflict, especially at a funeral, so I ignored it. That choice cost me dearly. Over the next few months, life became a chaotic blur of responsibilities. Michael was gone, but the bills, the debt, the mortgage, and the medical expenses remained. Every day felt like a battle. I worked extended hours, reviewed documents late into the night, negotiated with creditors, balanced accounts, and made difficult financial decisions. Throughout it all, I shielded Ethan from the worst of it. He was 20, still in college, grieving, and trying to adjust to life without his father. I couldn't bear to add to his pain, so I carried everything alone. Initially, after Michael's death, Ethan and I grew closer. We spoke frequently on the phone, sometimes several times a day. When he came home from school, we would sit together for hours, sharing memories, funny stories, favourite vacations, and moments we had nearly forgotten. Some nights we laughed through tears, and some nights we just cried together. Those memories remain precious to me because they remind me of a time when my son trusted me completely, before doubt entered his mind, and before someone poisoned the way he viewed me. The change began gradually. So slowly I barely noticed it. A strange comment here, an unusual question there. Nothing dramatic, at least not at first. One afternoon, about 6 months after Michael passed, Ethan called out of the blue. His tone seemed different, more guarded, more serious. He asked if his father had left any life insurance. The question caught me off guard, but I answered truthfully that he had. After a pause, he asked how much. I remember feeling uncomfortable, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because the question seemed unusual. Still, I told him the truth, giving him a rough amount. Another silence followed, this one longer, before he simply said, "Okay," and quickly changed the subject. I didn't think much of it then, but now I understand completely. That conversation wasn't initiated by Ethan, it was started by Linda. A few weeks later, another strange conversation occurred. Ethan was home for the weekend, and we were having lunch together. Everything seemed normal until he casually asked an incredibly specific question. Did his father owe anyone money? My fork hovered in the air. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The true answer was yes, a significant amount. But I had promised Michael, and more importantly, I still believed protecting Ethan was the right thing to do. I asked why he was wondering, and Ethan just shrugged, saying it was for no particular reason. But I knew there had to be a reason. People don't ask those kinds of questions out of nowhere. Something had begun, something I couldn't see, and because I couldn't see it, I couldn't stop it. Over the next few years, Linda became increasingly involved in Ethan's life. She called him frequently, invited him to dinner, spent holidays with him, and positioned herself as a second parent. Initially, I was grateful. I truly thought she was helping him navigate his grief and maintain a connection with his father's side of the family. I had no idea she was quietly rewriting history, one conversation, one hint, and one lie at a time. The first significant fracture appeared when Ethan graduated from college. We were celebrating at a restaurant with a room full of family. Everyone seemed happy until someone commented on how hard I had worked to put Ethan through school. Before I could respond, Linda laughed softly and remarked that I had received plenty of help. The comment sounded innocent, but her tone made me uneasy. I noticed Ethan glance at her. A brief look, as if they shared a private understanding. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with me because it felt like I had missed a part of the conversation. Time moved rapidly. Ethan's career flourished. He met Rachel, fell in love, and got engaged. Throughout it all, I remained incredibly proud of him, attending every major milestone, celebration, and achievement. I never stopped being his biggest supporter. However, something subtle continued to shift. He called less often, visited less frequently, and shared fewer details about his life. At first, I attributed it to him becoming an adult. People get busy, life gets complicated, and families expand. It seemed normal, but eventually the distance became impossible to ignore, especially after he married Rachel. Rachel wasn't a bad person. She was smart, successful, and independent, and she loved Ethan. The issue wasn't Rachel. The issue was what she was hearing, and from whom. Linda quickly became close with her too. Far too close. Family gatherings often ended with the two of them sitting together, talking in low voices. Sometimes they stopped when I approached, and sometimes they didn't, but I could feel something changing. A narrative was forming. A story was being constructed. And in that story, I wasn't the hero. I wasn't even neutral. I was the problem. Then came the first accusation. Not direct or harsh, but enough to hurt. It happened during Thanksgiving dinner. Rachel mentioned how difficult the loss of a loved one can be for a family. Before I could say anything, Ethan sighed and remarked that I had never really moved on. The room fell silent. I offered a strained laugh and asked what he meant. Ethan shrugged and said I knew what he meant, but I insisted I didn't. Looking uncomfortable, he stated it was as if I enjoyed being a grieving widow. The words felt like a slap in the face. Everyone looked uneasy. Rachel immediately looked down, and Linda remained completely silent. But I noticed one thing. Linda wasn't surprised at all. She had heard these thoughts before. Perhaps she was the one who planted the seed. The night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room. The house was painfully quiet as I replayed Ethan's words in my mind. Enjoying being a grieving widow made absolutely no sense. There was nothing enjoyable about grief, nothing enjoyable about carrying Michael's secrets, and nothing enjoyable about spending years paying off his debts. Yet somehow, my son believed it. For the first time, a terrifying possibility crossed my mind. Someone had been talking to Ethan for years, feeding him a false version of our story. I just didn't know how much damage had already been done, or how much worse it would get. While I was trying to protect my son's memory of his father, someone else was slowly destroying his trust in his mother. By the time I finally understood who was responsible, the damage was irreversible. If I have learned one thing about fractured relationships, it is that they rarely shatter all at once. They erode slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly. By the time you realize how much damage has been done, the entire foundation is already gone. That is exactly what happened between Ethan and me. After that Thanksgiving dinner, I told myself not to overreact. People say hurtful things. Families go through difficult times, and perhaps Ethan was stressed, or his grief was still lingering beneath the surface. Maybe I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I wanted to believe those explanations, but unfortunately, reality was different. Over the next few years, the distance between us continued to grow. Not through dramatic arguments or explosive conflicts, but through hundreds of tiny moments. Missed calls, shorter conversations, less warmth, less patience, and less trust. Sometimes the change was so subtle I questioned my own judgment, and other times it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I called Ethan just to say hello. Rachel answered, sounding polite but distant. After a brief exchange, she mentioned that Ethan had been under a lot of stress lately. I replied that I knew and was just checking to make sure he was okay. After a pause, she remarked that sometimes she felt he thought he had to be responsible for my happiness. The comment caught me completely off guard. Responsible for my happiness? I hadn't asked Ethan to manage my emotions, I didn't call him daily, and I wasn't demanding his attention. In fact, I often went weeks without hearing from him. Yet somehow, an impression had formed around me, the impression of a needy mother, a mother who was a burden, a mother with unreasonable expectations. Hanging up the phone, I sat alone in the kitchen trying to understand where that idea came from, because it certainly wasn't something I had communicated to him. As time passed, I began to notice something else. Linda's influence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Every major misunderstanding seemed to trace back to her, and every conflict seemed to include fragments of language that sounded suspiciously familiar. Comments about control, comments about guilt, and comments about manipulation. These were the words Linda had quietly used for years, and Ethan was now repeating them. Initially, he used them carefully and subtly, but later it became more open. One Christmas, we were discussing family traditions. It should have been a pleasant conversation, but instead it turned painful. I mentioned how much Michael used to love decorating the house. The moment the words left my mouth, Ethan sighed heavily. I still remember that sound. It contained irritation, impatience, and exhaustion, as if he had heard enough. He muttered that it was just like usual. I looked at him, asking what he meant, and he rubbed his forehead, complaining that everything always circled back to his father. The atmosphere in the room became awkward. Rachel stared at her coffee cup, and Linda remained unusually quiet, watching and observing, never correcting, never intervening, and never helping. I swallowed hard and reminded him that his father was my husband, and he had passed away. Ethan shook his head and claimed that sometimes it felt like I used that to my advantage. The statement stunned me. Using my husband's passing to my advantage? Using my grief, my loss? I truly didn't know how to answer. The accusation felt so disconnected from reality that I struggled to process it. What exactly was I gaining from it? Sympathy, attention, control? The idea seemed absurd, yet my son clearly believed it. Belief is powerful, especially when it has been nurtured for years. That night, after everyone left, I cried for hours. Not because of what Ethan said, but because of what the situation revealed. The son who had once trusted me unconditionally had begun to view me through someone else's eyes, and I didn't know how to stop it. After Rachel and Ethan had their daughter Emily, things became even worse. Becoming a grandparent should be one of the happiest chapters of life, and in many ways, it was. Emily was wonderful, smart, kind, and full of curiosity. She reminded me of Ethan when he was little. For a time, spending days with her helped fill the void that had grown elsewhere. But even those relationships became complicated, not because of Emily, but because of the adults around her. I noticed Ethan becoming increasingly protective of boundaries. Again, boundaries themselves weren't the problem. Healthy boundaries are important. The issue lay in the assumptions behind them. Every request I made was viewed with suspicion.
Every suggestion became evidence of my interference, and every attempt to help was somehow interpreted as criticism.
One instance stands out clearly in my mind. Rachel had recently returned to work, and Emily was about 8 years old. They were struggling to balance their schedules, so one evening I offered to help, simply suggesting I could pick Emily up from school a few days a week to make things easier for them. The offer was made out of love, genuine care, and a desire to support my family. Ethan's reaction shocked me when he snapped that they didn't need me managing their lives. The words felt like a heavy blow. I stared at him, completely confused, insisting I wasn't trying to manage anything and was just offering to help. He crossed his arms and claimed I always did that. The question of what exactly I always did echoed in my mind, because I truly didn't understand. Rachel quickly changed the subject, ending the conversation, but the hurt remained. Driving home that night, I cried in my car, not because he declined my help, but because he assigned motives that didn't exist. Somewhere along the line, my actions were no longer interpreted as love. They were filtered through a lens of suspicion, and suspicion changes everything. The years continued to pass. Linda kept talking, Ethan kept listening, and I kept my silence. Looking back, that silence may have been my greatest mistake, not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because when the truth refuses to defend itself, the lies grow stronger. I had always assumed the truth would eventually emerge, that people would see reality, and character would speak for itself. Instead, the opposite occurred. The absence of truth left room for false stories to thrive, and they grew abundantly. By the time Emily reached high school, Ethan's perception of me had changed dramatically. I was no longer just his mother. I was a symbol, a collection of assumptions, a version of Gwen Sullivan that existed primarily in his mind. A woman who manipulated through guilt, a woman who enjoyed being pitied, a woman who exaggerated her hardships, and a woman who controlled others emotionally. The tragedy was that none of it was true, yet when a lie is repeated enough, even the most absurd falsehood begins to sound convincing, especially when the words come from someone you trust. Then, the conversation that nearly broke me occurred, about a year before Emily's 16th birthday. I invited Ethan to lunch, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in a long time. Initially, everything seemed pleasant as we discussed work, Emily's grades, and daily life. Then somehow the topic turned to family finances, and suddenly Ethan said something that chilled me. He mentioned that Aunt Linda had told him something interesting. The moment he uttered her name, I felt a tightness in my chest. When I asked what it was, he looked straight at me and stated she said his father had left enough money to take care of everyone. I immediately understood the implication. The insurance money, the same lie, still alive, still spreading, and still poisoning everything. I cautiously asked what else, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression not angry, but worse. Disappointed, like a man finally accepting an unpleasant truth. He admitted that sometimes he wondered where all that money went. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe, not because I lacked an answer, but because I suddenly realized how deep the damage had become. My own son believed I might have stolen his money. After everything, after every sacrifice, every debt paid, every sleepless night, and every promise kept, he believed I might have pocketed funds meant for our family. In that moment, I finally understood something terrible. Linda hadn't just turned Ethan against me. She had spent years replacing reality with fiction, carefully planting one seed at a time. Unless things changed, those lies would eventually grow large enough to destroy whatever remained of our family. The worst part was that I still hadn't told anyone the truth. Not yet. But that moment was approaching much faster than I realized, because the next time Ethan publicly questioned my character, something inside me would finally reach its limit. The night Ethan told me to stop playing the victim, I drove home in complete silence. The birthday party had ended quickly after my announcement. No one knew what to say. Rachel looked shocked. Emily looked confused. Linda looked nervous, and Ethan looked furious. Not an explosive anger, but a self-righteous anger, the kind that comes from believing he had finally spoken the truth. Pulling into the driveway, I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at my dark house, feeling completely exhausted emotionally. 12 years of silence, 12 years of carrying secrets, 12 years of protecting others without protecting myself. And for what? To be called manipulative, accused of playing the victim, and treated like a thief for the first time in my life. I stopped asking myself if revealing the truth would hurt others. Instead, I began to ask if hiding it had already caused them greater harm. Eventually, I stepped out of the car and entered the house. The home felt as it always did. Quiet, lonely, and still. Michael had been gone for over a decade, but reminders of him were still everywhere. Photographs, books, old tools in the garage. Tiny reminders of a life that once existed. I stood in the living room, staring at a framed family photo of Michael standing between Ethan and me, all three of us smiling, looking happy and complete. The image was painful, not because it was entirely false, but because it was only partially true. We had been happy, But we had also been hiding things, and eventually, what is hidden demands to be discovered. I went upstairs to the attic, somewhere I hadn't been in years, truly, except to store Christmas decorations or old boxes. But I knew exactly where I was going. Near the back wall sat a large grey storage bin, its lid covered in dust, the plastic looking older than I remembered. I stared at it for a long moment. That bin held 12 years of silence. Every secret, every sacrifice, every lie, everything. My hands shook as I pulled it toward me, the lid creaking as I opened it. Inside were folders, envelopes, bank statements, medical records, letters, receipts, and loan documents. A lifetime of evidence I had hoped never to use, but had preserved anyway. Perhaps a part of me always knew this day would come. I carried the bin downstairs and placed it on the dining room table, then began organising its contents. The first folder contained financial records from many years, payment confirmations, debt settlements, bank withdrawals, and insurance statements, all neatly organised. I offered a bitter smile. The old accountant in me had never disappeared. When everything collapsed into chaos years ago, keeping records became my survival mechanism. When everything else felt out of control, the paperwork provided structure, evidence, facts, and reality. Reality was becoming incredibly important because for years people had lived in a fantasy where Michael was flawless, Gwen Sullivan was selfish, money had vanished mysteriously, and grief was just an act. That fantasy was about to end. Document after document brought back painful memories, hospital bills, home loans, credit card settlements, and debt agreements. I remembered every sacrifice attached to those pages. The vacations we never took, the vanished retirement savings, the second job I worked for nearly 2 years, and the nights spent crying silently alone, so Ethan wouldn't hear. Each piece of paper carried a story, and each story came with a cost. Hours passed, and the house grew darker as rain began to patter gently against the windows. Still, I continued sorting. Next, I found the insurance records, the documents Ethan believed I had hidden, the ones that supposedly proved my greed. I laughed bitterly. If only he knew. The payout had seemed substantial on paper, but how much remained after paying off the debts? Almost nothing. Most people never saw that part. They heard the initial amount and stopped listening, imagining wealth, security, and freedom, when the reality was vastly different. Michael's debts consumed the vast majority of it. Medical bills took more, and the home mortgage took even more. By the time everything was settled, little remained, certainly not enough to justify the accusations Ethan believed. I placed the insurance records in a separate pile. Those would be important later. Very important. Then I discovered something I hadn't looked at in years. A thick envelope with Linda's name written on it. My heart tightened instantly, and I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were copies of checks, loan records, and handwritten notes. Suddenly, memories flooded back. The loans, the money Michael had borrowed, and the arrangements they made privately. I slowly reviewed each document, the dates, the amounts, and the signatures. Everything was there, more than I remembered, and likely more than Linda remembered too. A cold realization washed over me. Linda didn't just know about Michael's gambling. She was deeply involved in it, much deeper than anyone realized. If Ethan saw these documents, her carefully constructed narrative would instantly collapse. For years, she had presented herself as the caring sister, the family protector, and the person trying to preserve Michael's memory. But these papers revealed a much uglier reality. I set the envelope aside. The conversation could wait. There was one more folder, the hardest one to face. I recognized it immediately, its cover covered in Michael's handwriting. Just seeing it brought tears to my eyes. I sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt incredibly quiet, almost sacred, because I knew what was inside. Letters, several of them, written during the final months of his life. Most were addressed to me, some containing financial instructions and others apologies, things he found easier to write down than say aloud. For years, I had avoided reading them, Not because I forgot they existed, but because they were too painful. Now I carefully opened the folder, the paper feeling fragile beneath my fingertips as I read one letter, then another, each bringing back memories. Some painful, some beautiful, and some heartbreaking. Michael wasn't an entirely bad man. If he had been, it would have been easier. Bad men are simple. Michael was much more complex. A flawed man who loved his family, made terrible choices that caused immense destruction, and also felt deep remorse. Both things were true, and perhaps that was why I remained silent for so long. Because the truth is rarely simple. At the bottom of the folder, I found something I had almost forgotten existed. A sealed envelope, unlike the other letters, not addressed to me. My breath caught. On the front, in Michael's familiar handwriting, were 3 words. To Ethan. My hands began to shake as I remembered this envelope. Many years ago, after Michael died, I couldn't bring myself to open it, nor could I bring myself to destroy it, so I tucked it away and forgot about it. Or perhaps I chose to forget. I picked it up slowly, the paper slightly yellowed with age. 12 years this letter had waited, while Ethan constructed an image of a father who didn't fully exist, while Linda rewrote history, and while I carried the blame. I stared at the envelope for a long time before carefully opening it. As I unfolded the pages inside, my heart raced with the sudden realization that this wasn't just another letter. It was likely the only piece of evidence that could change everything. Not because it came from me, but because it came from Michael himself. The words he wrote on those pages were about to alter the story my family had believed for so long. After reading Michael's letter, I barely slept, not because the content shocked me entirely, but because seeing his words again after so many years brought his voice back through the ink and paper. I felt his remorse, his fear, his love for Ethan, and the weight of his guilt, so much heavy guilt. By sunrise, my dining room table looked like the command center of a legal investigation. Documents covered every surface. Folders were stacked neatly by category. Sticky notes marked important dates, and financial statements were spread out. For the first time in years, I stopped viewing these papers as memories and saw them as evidence that could finally reveal the truth. The first task was simple: trace the money. After all, money had become the core of almost every accusation against me. The mysterious insurance payout, the rumoured hidden wealth, the money Ethan believed I had selfishly kept, and the money Linda constantly hinted at. So I started from the beginning, reviewing Michael's life insurance policy, claim forms, payout records, and deposit confirmations. The numbers aligned perfectly with my memory, bringing back a flood of emotions. 12 years ago, when that money arrived, I remember feeling relief. Not joy or excitement, but relief because I already knew how much destruction Michael's addiction had caused. The insurance money wasn't a windfall. It was a lifeline. And even then, it wasn't enough to resolve everything. I located the original notebook where I recorded every major expenditure after Michael passed away. Its pages worn with age and my handwriting filling every line. I slowly turned the pages, painful memories returning with each entry. The mortgage, medical expenses, credit card settlements, debt negotiations, attorney fees, and tax obligations. I remembered sitting at the same dining table years ago, calculating how much of the insurance money would remain after clearing those debts. The answer was devastating, almost nothing. At the time, I never complained or felt like a victim. I simply did what was necessary. That is what mothers do, what wives often do. We fix problems while pretending they aren't hurting us. One document particularly caught my attention. A summary I made shortly after Michael's death. A simple breakdown of the insurance money received, debts paid, the mortgage secured, education funds set aside, and the final remaining balance. I stared at the numbers for a few minutes and offered a bitter laugh, the kind that comes when reality feels almost absurd. Because if Ethan had seen this document years ago, almost all the accusations would have vanished instantly. The truth was brutal and clear. I hadn't hidden the money. I had spent it protecting him, his future, his education, and the house he grew up in. I continued through the records and soon reached the section concerning Ethan's college years, a stack of papers particularly difficult to face, because each payment represented a sacrifice Michael would never see. Tuition invoices, housing fees, books, transportation, and emergency expenses, semester after semester, year after year. Many of those payments came directly from the insurance funds, not because I was wealthy, but because I wanted Ethan to have opportunities I never had. I recalled a specific conversation when Ethan was halfway through college and money was incredibly tight. He called one night, casually mentioning a study abroad opportunity, sounding excited and hopeful. The program wasn't cheap, far from it, and I knew instantly I couldn't easily afford it without cutting back elsewhere. But I also knew how much it meant to him, so I made it happen, selling jewelry, working extra hours, delaying home repairs, and gathering funds to cover the cost. When Ethan thanked me, I told him not to worry, never explaining what it cost, because parents really do. We hide the cost and focus on the result. Now, 12 years later, this same son believed I had stolen his money. The irony was painful. As I continued sorting, another realization emerged. The insurance money hadn't just protected Ethan, it had also protected Michael's reputation. If I had refused to pay certain debts, creditors would have pursued them publicly, potentially leading to lawsuits and public records. Questions would have been asked, and the truth about Michael's gambling might have emerged immediately after his death. Instead, I quietly cleared everything, carrying the burden to protect the image of the man Ethan loved, exactly as Michael had asked. Somehow that sacrifice had become the evidence used to accuse me. By mid-afternoon, I reached another section of records, the mortgage file, which held some of the toughest memories because losing the house had been a very real possibility. After Michael passed, several financial obligations pressed in simultaneously. While income disappeared, expenses grew, and the debt remained. There were times I truly feared I couldn't keep our home, the house where Ethan grew up, filled with family memories. The home Michael had worked hard to buy before things went wrong. The insurance money helped stabilize that situation. Without it, the house likely would have been lost, eventually. I found past letters from the bank confirming payments, adjustments, settlements, and protection plans, each telling the same story. The money went where it was needed, not where people imagined, where rumors claimed, or where Linda suggested. Reality and gossip are rarely aligned. Then I discovered something unexpected, a receipt I hadn't noticed before that initially seemed unimportant, just another financial record until I saw the name, Linda Harper. My heart rate quickened as I examined the document more closely. It wasn't just a receipt. It was evidence concerning a transaction that occurred shortly after Michael's death, involving a significant amount of money. An amount that contradicted everything Linda had implied for years. I dug deeper, and another document appeared, then another, and another. Suddenly, a pattern emerged. The more I looked, the clearer the situation became. Linda wasn't just lying. She was covering up her own involvement, her own financial connection to Michael, and the benefits she received from the very situation she had blamed me for over the years. I leaned back in my chair as the realization washed over me like cold water. This was much more serious than I initially thought because Linda's motives suddenly made sense. If Ethan knew the whole truth, questions would inevitably arise. Questions she didn't want to answer about the money, the loans, the promises, and who exactly benefited from Michael's secrecy. For years she had stayed ahead of those questions by controlling the narrative, casting Gwen as the villain to divert attention from everything else. Simple, effective, cruel, and unfortunately, successful.
Until now?
As evening approached, I sorted the most important documents into several folders. Folder 1, insurance records. Folder 2, debt repayment. Folder 3, college tuition. Folder 4, mortgage records. And Folder 5, Linda. That final folder was much larger than I anticipated, and I hadn't even finished reviewing everything. I reached for another envelope at the bottom of the bin, containing early financial records from Michael's final years, most of which were familiar, until a single page caught my eye. a signed acknowledgement of debt dated a few months before Michael passed away. My eyes widened as I read it once, twice, then a third time, suddenly understanding something vital. This document wasn't just evidence. It was written, signed confirmation, proving Linda owed Michael far more money than anyone imagined. If this truth became known within the family, her entire version of history would collapse overnight. Since leaving Emily's birthday party, I felt an emotion other than sadness, grief, and exhaustion for the first time. I felt determination. The truth was no longer hidden. It sat on my dining room table, and soon everyone would see it. That signed acknowledgement sat on my table like a loaded weapon. I must have read it 20 times, perhaps more, each time arriving at the same conclusion. Linda Harper had spent years lying because the truth, if threatened, posed a far greater danger to her than to me. For over a decade, I assumed she simply disliked me, resented me, blamed me for Michael's mistakes, or enjoyed family drama. Explanations that had seemed plausible. Now I realized something much darker. Linda wasn't protecting Michael, she was protecting herself, and that changed everything. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down again to review the papers as the morning sun began to rise outside. I hadn't slept much, but exhaustion no longer mattered. The pieces were finally coming together after all these years. The acknowledgement was dated 8 months before Michael's death, clearly stating Linda owed him money, not the other way around. The amount wasn't small. It was a substantial sum, much more than I had known about. Attached to the document were copies of checks, transfer records, and several handwritten notes. The more I examined them, the more disturbing the picture became. For years, Ethan had been told Linda helped Michael financially, saving him from debt repeatedly, and making sacrifices for her brother. That story was partially true, but it was far from the whole truth. According to the records before me, the arrangement had another side. Linda had been borrowing money from Michael for years. Thousands of dollars, sometimes in large amounts.
Sometimes small, always accompanied by promises to repay that she apparently never kept.
A memory emerged unexpectedly, one I had almost forgotten. About 15 years ago, Michael and I attended a family barbecue at Linda's house. At one point during the evening, I overheard an argument between them. Nothing dramatic, just a tense whisper near the garage. When Michael returned, he looked upset, and Linda looked embarrassed. When I asked about it later, he brushed it off lightly as just some family business. At the time, I believed him. Now, I can't help but wonder if that argument was entirely about money. Maybe many of their private conversations revolved around finances. Maybe there was much more happening beneath the surface than I ever realized. As I was sorting through the papers, another memory surfaced, then another. Tiny details. Small, fleeting moments that seemed completely meaningless back then. Now they felt incredibly significant. I remembered how often Linda turned to Michael for help. Short-term loans, emergency bailouts, help with repairs, unexpected bills and sudden expenses. Michael rarely said no. It was one of his greatest qualities, but it was also his deepest vulnerability. He found it incredibly difficult to let people down, even when helping them put a strain on his own household. Especially when it came to family. The realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. Because while Michael's reckless financial decisions had caused massive damage, he wasn't the only one making irresponsible choices. Others had recognized his inability to say no and used it to their advantage. They took what they could, and Linda seemed to be right at the top of that list. I reached for another folder and pulled out a note written in Michael's handwriting. It was short, simple, and undeniably real. The note explicitly detailed a repayment schedule Linda had agreed to follow, a schedule she completely ignored. I checked the dates against our bank records. There was nothing. Not a single payment was ever recorded after that day. No evidence of her fulfilling her end of the deal. Just promises. Broken promises. Suddenly, the timeline became perfectly clear. If Ethan had discovered Linda owed Michael money, it would have raised several deeply uncomfortable questions. Questions she couldn't easily answer. Things like, why didn't you pay him back? Why did you tell everyone he was financially dependent on you? Why did you spend years criticizing Gwen? Why did you keep this a secret? The answers would have exposed her completely, and Linda clearly understood that. So, instead of defending her actions, she created a completely different narrative, a safer story with a built-in villain. And that villain was me. The more I thought about it, the more everything clicked into place. The passing remarks, the rumours, the subtle accusations, the carefully planted doubts. None of it happened overnight. It was cultivated. Slowly, patiently, and strategically. Just like a gardener planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. And they certainly grew. By the time Ethan became an adult, those seeds had matured into deeply held beliefs. Dangerous convictions. The phone rang suddenly, making me jump. The caller ID showed Robert, my older brother. One of the very few people who knew a part of the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I picked it up immediately. "Good morning." "You sound exhausted," Robert said. "I am." He paused for a moment. "Was the birthday party that bad?" I let out a hollow laugh. "Worse than that."
After a brief silence, I told him everything. The confrontation, Ethan's accusations, and my final decision to reveal the truth. Robert listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh.
"I've been waiting for this conversation for years." His reaction didn't surprise me. Robert had urged me to speak up more times than I could count. "You've protected everyone except yourself, Gwen," he said. "No. No, Gwen, I don't think you do." His voice softened. "You protected Michael." "Yes." "You protected Ethan." "Yes." "You even protected Linda." I closed my eyes because he was absolutely right. In some strange, twisted way, I had protected her. By staying silent, I had allowed everyone else's version of the story to survive, even when those stories were destroying my reputation, even when they were complete lies. Robert continued, "You realize Ethan only knows the story he was fed, right?" That sentence hit me hard. Beneath all my anger lay another painful reality. Ethan wasn't born believing these things about me. He was taught to believe them, day after day, year after year. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it finally explained it. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Then I told Robert about the documents, every single one of them. The loans, the written notes, the bank confirmations, all the undeniable evidence. His response was immediate. "My goodness." "Exactly. And you still have everything? Every single page?" "Good." I could hear a newfound determination in his voice, the same resolve I was just beginning to feel myself. "Then it's time." It's time, such a simple phrase, yet it terrified me, because once the truth is out, you can never take it back. Families change. Relationships shift. Everything changes. Deep down, I was still terrified of the fallout. What if Ethan refused to believe me? What if Rachel defended Linda? What if the family completely fractured? What if exposing the truth only caused more pain? Robert seemed to sense my hesitation. "Gwen?" "Yes?" "This family is already broken." Those words carried an immense weight because they were true. I wasn't risking a healthy, happy family. I was confronting a family that was already deeply damaged. The only difference was that the damage had been hidden away. Just like Michael's financial troubles were hidden. Just like Linda's lies were hidden. Just like my sacrifices were hidden. The truth wasn't going to create problems. It was simply going to expose the ones that already existed. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a few minutes, thinking, remembering, and preparing myself. Then another thought entered my mind. Emily, my granddaughter. Unlike the adults, Emily still approached life with honesty, curiosity, and a sense of fairness. Recently, I had noticed something interesting. She had started asking questions. Small, cautious questions that hinted she didn't entirely buy into the family narrative. A memory from her birthday party, just before the big argument, surfaced. Emily had quietly pulled me aside and asked something that caught me off guard. "Oh, Grandma, why does Aunt Linda always look so angry whenever people talk about Grandpa's money?" At the time, I brushed the question off. Now it felt incredibly important. Children often notice the exact things adults try so hard to ignore. Emily had been watching for years, perhaps seeing the truth clearer than anyone else. Their thought gave me a glimmer of hope. Not because Emily could fix anything, but because the truth always leaves a trail, no matter how hard people try to bury it. And those trails were finally starting to appear. By the time evening arrived, my mind was made up. No more silence. No more protecting lies. No more carrying blame that wasn't mine. I picked up my phone. One by one, I began contacting the family. Ethan, Rachel, Robert, a few others, and yes, even Linda. My message was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. I invited everyone to my house next weekend. I told them there was something important they needed to hear. Something that was long overdue. Most replied politely, though some seemed confused. A few sounded visibly nervous. But there was one response that stood out above the rest. Linda's. She called me within minutes of receiving the text. The moment I heard the sharp tension in her voice, I knew one thing for certain. She was afraid.
For the first time in years, Linda Harper was genuinely frightened, which meant she already had a very good idea of exactly what I was planning to do.
The week leading up to the family meeting felt longer than any week I could remember. Each day dragged on, and every hour seemed to pass in slow motion. Every night I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, visualizing exactly how the confrontation would play out. For 12 long years, I had kept the truth hidden. Now I was preparing to lay it out directly in front of everyone. There would be no turning back, no room for second thoughts, and no more silence.
The morning of the meeting arrived with an overcast sky and heavy, low-hanging clouds. Dark, stormy weather loomed over the city of Columbus. I woke up well before sunrise and brewed a pot of coffee, not because I wanted to drink it, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. My nerves were completely shot.
The dining room table was covered in neatly arranged folders, each one clearly labelled, each containing a piece of a story that no one had ever heard in full. Insurance statements, debt records, mortgage documents, college tuition receipts, Michael's personal letters, Linda's financial logs, and finally, the letter addressed to Ethan. The letter that could change absolutely everything. I looked at those documents and felt the crushing weight of 12 years pressing down on my chest. At 10 a.m., I started setting up the room. I brought in extra chairs, set out water glasses, and prepared the coffee station. Nothing fancy. This wasn't a celebration. It wasn't even a real family gathering. This was a reckoning. By noon, my stomach was tied in knots. At 1 p.m., the first car pulled into the driveway. It was Robert, my brother. He walked through the front door carrying the same calm, grounded confidence that had always kept me steady. The moment he looked at my face, he wrapped me in a tight embrace. "Ready?" "Not at all." He gave me a slight smile. "Good." I couldn't help but smile back. "What do you mean by that?" "It means you're taking this seriously." His eyes drifted over to the rows of folders on the table. "You don't need to win today, Gwen." "I don't?" "No." He shook his head firmly. "You just need to tell the truth."
Somehow those words instantly eased my anxiety, because he was entirely right. I wasn't there to destroy anyone. I wasn't there to punish or seek revenge. I was simply there to put an end to the lies, even if those lies had initially been created with good intentions.
Just after 2 p.m., Rachel and Ethan arrived. I watched them through the front window as Ethan stepped out of the driver's seat, with Rachel following closely behind. Neither of them looked happy, and neither looked relaxed. The tension between them was palpable. The moment Ethan walked inside, his eyes immediately locked onto the folders. His expression hardened instantly. "What is all this?" His tone defensive and guarded. I took a deep breath. "We'll talk once everyone gets here." He looked annoyed, but took a seat anyway. Rachel sat silently beside him. For a moment, nobody said a word. The silence felt heavy, suffocating, and incredibly uncomfortable. Then another car arrived, and Emily burst through the door a moment later. Unlike the adults, she didn't try to mask her emotions. She looked anxious, curious, and deeply worried all at once. She came straight to me and held me tight. "I love you, Grandma." That unexpected gesture nearly broke my composure. I squeezed her back just as tightly. "I love you too, sweetheart." As she let go, I noticed Ethan watching us. A flash of emotion crossed his face. Maybe guilt, maybe uncertainty, before vanishing just as quickly. The final guest arrived 15 minutes later, Linda. The moment I saw her step out of her car, I knew she understood exactly why she was there. Her usual confidence felt incredibly forced, and her smile looked completely rehearsed. As she stepped into the house, her eyes darted instantly to the folders on the table. She froze for a split second, a tiny tell, but I caught it. Robert noticed it too. Linda recovered quickly, her voice taking on an unnaturally casual tone. What is all this?" she asked, repeating the exact question Ethan had asked moments earlier. Interesting, I replied quietly. You'll find out soon enough. After that, any remaining comfort vanished completely. Everyone took their seats around the table, making the room feel smaller and far more crowded than usual. The very air in the room seemed to tighten with anticipation. I looked around the table at my son, my granddaughter, my daughter-in-law, my brother, and my late husband's sister. The people who mattered most to me, and the ones who had hurt me the deepest. Somehow, they were the exact same people. For a fleeting second, fear almost made me back down. What if this ends terribly? What if the truth isn't enough? What if years of calculated lies prove more powerful than actual evidence? Then I remembered the birthday party. I remembered the harsh echo of Ethan's voice telling me to stop playing the victim. That pain rushed back instantly, bringing a sudden sharp clarity with it. I wasn't doing this because I wanted to. I was doing it because I had no other choice. I folded my hands tightly on the table and began. Thank you all for coming. No one responded. The heavy silence remained. I called you here because there are things that should have been said years ago. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Linda crossed her arms tightly, while Rachel kept her head lowered. Emily listened intently, her eyes wide. I spent 12 years keeping promises, I said, looking directly at Ethan. Some of those promises were meant to protect the people I love. Then I turned my gaze to Linda. And others protected people who never deserved that protection. Linda's jaw tightened slightly. Just a tiny twitch, but it was enough. The room grew even quieter as I continued. At Emily's birthday party, Ethan accused me of looking for pity. My son's face flushed deeply. Mom, no, I said, raising a hand firmly. This time you're going to listen to me. The sheer resolve in my voice surprised even me, and Ethan closed his mouth instantly. I had spent years avoiding conflict, backing down, and choosing superficial peace over confrontation. But today was different. Today, I was going to finish what I started. I opened the first folder, revealing the insurance records. I want everyone to understand one thing clearly. I slid the photocopies across the table. These are the actual financial records from Michael's life insurance policy. Rachel picked up her copy, Emily leaned forward to see, Ethan looked deeply skeptical, and Linda began to fidget. I continued. For years it has been heavily implied that I kept this money entirely for myself. Nobody spoke. Nobody denied it, because everyone in that room knew exactly who had dropped those hints. I pointed directly at the documents. Take a look for yourselves. The sharp sound of rustling paper filled the room. Minutes ticked by. Rachel's brow furrowed deeply, her expression shifting into complete confusion. Emily's eyes widened, and Ethan stared intensely at the pages, his defensive look slowly melting away as confusion replaced his certainty. Meanwhile, Linda sat completely still, entirely too still. I recognized that posture instantly. It was the stance of someone calculating their next move, someone realizing a situation has completely spiraled out of their control. Once everyone had finished reviewing the papers, I spoke again. This is exactly where the money went. I pointed to a highlighted section. The mortgage. I pointed to another. Medical debt. Then another. Creditors. And finally, Ethan's college tuition.
Silence. Absolute, pure silence. The kind of silence that only happens when a long-held belief completely shatters.
Ethan was the first to look up, the confidence entirely gone from his face. I had no idea, he whispered, the words slipping out almost involuntarily. I nodded slowly. I know you didn't.
And that was the real tragedy of it all. It wasn't that he hated me. It was that he had spent years holding onto resentment without ever knowing the actual truth.
But we were just getting started. The insurance records were only the first step. I opened another folder, and then another, laying out 12 years of reality, page by page. Every sacrifice, every payment, every debt, and every hidden burden. With every page I turned, the room fell into a deeper silence until absolutely no one was speaking. Not even Linda.
Finally, I reached for the last folder, the one I had saved for the very end. The folder containing records directly tied to her, the one that would explain everything.
The moment my hand touched it, I saw a flash of genuine terror cross Linda's face. It was the first completely honest emotion she had shown all afternoon, In that exact instant, I knew she already knew exactly what was inside. As I lifted that final folder, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. I watched it happen right in front of me, reflected clearly on their faces. Ethan leaned further forward, Rachel sat up straight, Emily stopped flipping through her papers, and Robert crossed his arms, waiting. And Linda just looked terrified, not nervous, not uncomfortable, truly frightened. For 12 years, she had completely controlled the narrative. For 12 years, she had directed the conversations, spreading doubt and shaping everyone's opinions. She had spent over a decade fully believing I would stay silent forever. Now she wasn't so sure. I opened the folder slowly. No one muttered a word, and the only sound in the room was the crisp rustle of paper. "I've shown you where the insurance money went," I said, looking straight at Ethan. "I've shown you the debts, and I've shown you the mortgage payments." I placed several documents directly in front of them. "Now, I want to show you something else." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, a tiny movement that spoke volumes. My voice remained steady and calm. For years I've heard the exact same story, repeated over and over. I paused for emphasis. The story of how Linda constantly stepped in to help Michael financially. No one interrupted me. The story of how Michael depended on her. Another pause. The story of how I somehow benefited from it all, while everyone else made sacrifices. I pushed the documents closer to them. Those stories were incredibly incomplete. Rachel picked up the first page. Her eyes narrowed instantly, then widened in shock. She quickly flipped to the next page, and then the next. Ethan followed along, and Emily leaned in closer to read. The heavy silence became almost unbearable. Finally, Rachel looked up at me. "What is this?"
I answered calmly. "That is the proof that Linda was actually borrowing money from Michael."
Nobody moved. Nobody seemed to even breathe. Rachel looked back down at the papers, and Ethan grabbed another document, then another, the colour completely draining from his face. Because the evidence was undeniable. Cashed cheques, signed acknowledgements, handwritten agreements, dates, amounts, and signatures. Cold, hard facts. The one thing a lie can never survive. Linda finally forced herself to speak. "That doesn't prove anything." The words came out entirely too fast, laced with heavy defence. I looked directly at her. "It proves you took the money, Linda." She crossed her arms tightly. "Michael borrowed from me too." "Yes, he did." Her confidence returned slightly. "See?" she said, pointing a finger at me. "Do you see?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I see. He did borrow from you." Her expression faltered. She clearly hadn't expected me to agree, but I wasn't there to tell half-truths. I wasn't there to replace one deception with another. Michael had borrowed money from Linda. That was a fact. But it wasn't the whole story, and that was the entire point. I reached into the folder for another set of papers. "Michael borrowed from you," I said, placing them firmly on the table. "And then you borrowed from him." I laid down another document. "And then you borrowed again. And again. And again." I pointed directly to the dates. "The only difference is Michael kept an exact record of everything." Nobody said a word. The entire room felt frozen in time. For years, Linda let everyone believe she was simply playing the role of the supportive sister, I said, looking directly at Ethan. But she never bothered to tell you that she owed him just as much in return. Ethan slowly turned his head to look at his aunt. His expression had completely transformed into a mix of confusion, disbelief, and deep suspicion. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at me with judgment. He was looking at her. Linda noticed the shift instantly, a wave of panic washing over her face. "You're twisting the facts, Gwen." "I don't need to twist anything," I said, shaking my head. "These documents speak perfectly for themselves." Then I reached for the letter, the one Michael had written to Ethan. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. Even Robert looked visibly moved. I held the envelope carefully. The paper felt old and fragile, preserved for 12 long years. It had waited over a decade for this exact moment. Ethan stared at it intensely. "What is that?" My throat tightened instantly. "A letter from your father."
His face went completely pale, and the room remained utterly quiet.
"He wrote this just before he passed away," I continued. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "You never told me about this." "No," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I couldn't. And that was the absolute truth." For years, I simply couldn't bring myself to reopen those old wounds and face that immense pain again. Maybe a part of me was terrified, or maybe a part of me was trying to protect him from the fallout. Perhaps it was a combination of both. I unfolded the letter, my hands trembling noticeably, and began to read aloud. The opening lines were simple and tender. Michael told Ethan how much he loved him, how incredibly proud he was of him, and how being his father was the greatest blessing of his entire life. By the second paragraph, Rachel was already quietly crying, and Emily was wiping tears from her face. Even Ethan looked deeply shaken. Then the tone of the letter shifted, becoming far more serious, deeply personal, and completely honest. Finally, I reached the paragraph that changed everything. Ethan, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. There are things you deserve to know. Your mother has spent years shielding me from the consequences of my own poor choices. The room seemed to completely freeze. I kept reading. She carried burdens that should have been entirely mine. She paid off the debts I created and quietly cleaned up my worst mistakes. She did all of this simply because she loved our family. Tears began to blur my vision, but I forced myself to push through. Michael's words filled the room, raw, painful, and completely unguarded. He described his financial struggles, his deep shame, his failures, and his immense remorse. Nothing was hidden, and nothing was minimized. Then came the exact sentence that shattered the illusion Ethan had carried for 12 long years. If there is anyone in this world who deserves your respect, it is your mother. Not because she is perfect, but because when it would have been so much easier for her to walk away, she chose to stay. Rachel placed a hand over her mouth. Emily wept openly, and Robert stared down fixedly at the table. Ethan looked completely, utterly broken. But the letter wasn't over yet. The final section delivered the heaviest blow of all. I know she will likely try to protect my memory after I'm gone. If she does, please remember one thing. I never earned that protection. She gave it freely out of grace. Please, never punish her for my mistakes. As I finished reading, the words seemed to hang heavily in the air. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and the silence felt absolutely infinite.
I carefully set the letter down, my heart pounding wildly against my chest and my hands shaking.
12 years. I had carried this truth completely alone for 12 years, and now it was finally out in the open. No more secrets, no more assumptions, and no more protecting destructive lies. The room remained perfectly still. Finally, Rachel broke the silence, whispering softly, "Oh my God!" No one answered her because there was nothing left to say. The truth had spoken for itself. Then something completely unexpected happened. Emily stood up from her chair, walked all the way around the table, and wrapped her arms tightly around me. There was no hesitation, no questions, and no conditions. That single act almost broke me entirely. I held her back tightly, tears streaming freely down my face. Looking over her shoulder, I saw Ethan staring blankly at the letter. He just kept staring at it, as if replaying every single accusation, every assumption, every harsh judgment, and every painful word he had ever hurled at me, watching them collide violently with reality.
Finally, he looked up at Linda. He did it slowly and deliberately, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Linda completely avoided his gaze. For the first time in my entire life, I saw her completely lost for words, unable to explain it away, and unable to control the conversation.
"Ethan," she began, her voice faltering. He cut her off instantly. No. That single sharp word shocked everyone in the room, including me. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His eyes were red, and his hands were visibly shaking. When he looked at me, I barely recognized the expression on his face. The anger was entirely gone. The absolute certainty was gone. The harsh judgment had vanished completely. In their place was something far more devastating. Complete and total collapse. The utter devastation of a son, realizing he had been completely wrong, profoundly wrong, for a very long time. As he looked back down at the letter, I knew that the hardest part of this day was only just beginning. I had imagined this exact moment countless times over the years. In some versions of my mind, Ethan got incredibly angry. In others, he denied everything completely. Sometimes he stormed out of the house, and sometimes he fiercely defended Linda. But I had never once envisioned this outcome. I had never imagined a silence this complete. After reading Michael's letter, the entire room felt entirely frozen. No one moved, no one spoke, and even the soft sound of the rain tapping against the window felt intensely loud. Ethan stood completely still by his chair, staring down at the pages in front of him. His father's handwriting, his father's confession, his father's apology, his father's truth. For 12 long years, he had held on to a version of Michael that simply didn't exist. A flawless father, a blameless man, a victim. Now that entire image was crumbling into dust, and I could see the sheer devastation written all over his face. A part of me wanted to reach out and comfort him. My maternal instinct was still there. It never truly goes away. But another part of me was still deeply wounded. The scars ran incredibly deep. Because while Ethan was discovering this painful truth today, I'd been living with it for over a decade, entirely alone. Finally, Rachel broke the heavy silence, turning toward him. "Ethan," her voice catching in her throat. He didn't reply. He just kept staring intently at the letter. Then he looked up at me. The look in his eyes nearly broke my heart. Because for the first time in so many years, I saw the little boy I used to know. Not the angry man, not the judging son, just that little boy. Lost, confused, and completely heartbroken. "Mum," the word came out as nothing more than a faint whisper. I swallowed hard, neither of us knowing what was supposed to happen next. Ethan looked around the room, taking in the documents, looking at Robert, at Emily, at Linda, and finally settling his gaze back on me. Is all of this true? The question carried absolutely no hostility or accusation. It was pure desperation, the sound of a man desperately clawing for one last piece of certainty to hold on to. I nodded slowly and firmly. Every single word. He looked down again, staring at the letter, then back up at me, as if hoping reality would somehow miraculously shift if he looked long enough. As if reading it one more time would produce a different result. It didn't. The truth remained right there on the table, unyielding and completely merciless. Rachel reached out to take his hand, but he barely seemed to notice her touch. Seconds stretched into a full minute, and then another. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I blamed you. Nobody answered. I held you responsible for everything." Still, absolute silence.
His voice began to tremble violently. "I blamed you for the things Dad did."
The room remained utterly still because there was absolutely nothing left to argue, nothing to explain away, and nothing to soften the blow. There was only the truth. Then Ethan looked directly at Linda, and the entire dynamic changed instantly. The confusion on his face hardened into something else entirely. Realization. And realization can be incredibly painful. "Aunt Linda." She looked visibly uncomfortable. "Yes, Ethan? When did you know?" The question landed like a hammer blow. Linda instantly shifted in her seat. "What do you mean by that?" Ethan's voice turned incredibly sharp. "When did you know about all of this?" She didn't answer. "When did you find out that Mom was paying off his debts?" Total silence. "When did you know the insurance money went entirely to the mortgage and my college tuition?" Still nothing but silence. For the first time in her life, Linda had absolutely no story prepared, no convenient explanation ready, and no easy scapegoat within reach. The spotlight was aimed directly at her, and she absolutely hated it. "I was only trying to protect your father's memory," she said, the excuse ringing completely hollow the moment it left her mouth. Everyone in the room knew it, especially Ethan.
His eyes narrowed sharply. "By turning me against my own mother?"
Linda opened her mouth to speak, then closed it just as quickly. There were no good answers left for her. Not anymore. Rachel suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "You told us she was hiding money." Linda offered no response. Rachel pressed further. "You told us she was manipulative." "Nothing. You told us she made Michael's life miserable." The silence became completely unbearable. I watched Rachel's face transform as realization, deep regret, and profound shame washed over her. For years she had believed pieces of those stories. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to change the way she looked at me, enough to impact her marriage, and enough to deeply affect our entire family. Then Emily stood up. There was no hesitation or fear in her actions, only pure honesty. The kind of unfiltered honesty adults so often lose. I always knew something wasn't right, she said. Everyone turned to look at her as she wiped a tear from her cheek. The way you talked about Grandma was never the way you talked about anyone else, Aunt Linda. She looked Linda straight in the eye. You always acted so strange whenever Grandpa was brought up. Linda looked completely stunned. Emily kept going. And you always got angry whenever Grandma said anything nice about him. Nobody stopped her because she was completely right. Children notice everything, far more than adults ever give them credit for. Emily turned to look at her father. Dad, Grandma has never said a bad word about anyone. That sentence hit Ethan with massive force. I could see the visible impact of it. Because even now, after everything that had happened, it was still completely true. I had never tried to ruin Linda. I had never tried to expose Michael. And I had never tried to protect myself by tearing someone else down. Maybe I should have a long time ago, but I didn't. And now everyone finally realized it. The room fell quiet for a few long minutes. Then Ethan slowly began to walk around the table. My heart started racing inside my chest, completely unsure of what he was about to do. No one else knew either. When he reached my side, he stopped and just stood there, looking down at me. His eyes were completely filled with tears. The exact same eyes I had watched grow from childhood into adulthood. The eyes that used to look at me with absolute trust, and the ones that had recently looked at me with nothing but harsh judgment. Now they held something completely different, pure, unadulterated remorse. Then Ethan did something that completely shocked everyone in the room. He dropped to his knees right beside my chair. Rachel let out a sharp gasp. Emily covered her mouth, and even Robert looked visibly stunned. I certainly was. My son looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely broken. I'm so sorry. Those words shattered something deep inside me. Not because they magically erased the years of pain, but because they were completely and utterly real. I'm so incredibly sorry, Mum. I closed my eyes tightly, unable to stop the tears from spilling over. For years I had constantly imagined hearing those exact words. Now that they were finally here, it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt heartbreaking. Because an apology cannot restore the lost years, it cannot undo the deep emotional wounds, and it cannot reverse the damage. It simply acknowledges it, and sometimes that hurts just as much. Ethan continued, his voice shaking violently. I thought I knew everything. I thought I understood exactly what happened.
More tears fell. I judged you.
A long pause. I humiliated you.
Another pause. I believed the lies.
The room was completely silent. Nobody looked away, and nobody interrupted. Everyone needed to hear this, especially Ethan himself. Then he spoke the words that cut the deepest of all. That birthday party, his face twisting with immense emotional pain. Oh my God. He lowered his head. The awful things I said to you, I remembered them instantly. Every single word, every accusation, every judging look from the family, and every second of intense humiliation. The memory was still incredibly painful, and looking at Ethan's expression, he knew it too. I can never take those words back. His voice faded to a barely audible whisper.
No, you can't, I said, speaking for the very first time. The words felt incredibly heavy.
Ethan nodded slowly, more tears hitting the floor. I know. Then he looked up at me again, his face completely devastated, looking just like a broken child. Can you ever forgive me? The question hung heavily in the air, filling the room. Everyone waited in absolute suspense. Rachel, Emily, Robert, and even Linda. They all looked at me, waiting for an answer. But forgiveness isn't a simple light switch. It isn't something you can just turn on the moment someone says they're sorry, especially not after 12 long years, especially not after repeated betrayals, and especially not after public humiliation. I looked down at my son, this man whom I loved deeply, the man who had hurt me so profoundly, and the man who was finally seeing the absolute truth. And I realized something incredibly important. I wasn't ready to answer him, not yet. I wasn't ready to give Ethan the answer he wanted. Not because I wanted to punish him, and not because I wanted revenge, but because forgiveness and healing are two completely different things. And healing takes time. After Ethan asked for my forgiveness, the room fell back into a deep, heavy quiet. Everyone stared at me, waiting and hoping for a neat resolution.
But life really gives us clean, tidy emotional endings. Not after 12 years of misdirection, not after thousands of microtraumas, and certainly not when an entire relationship has been built on a foundation of misunderstandings.
I looked down at my son, and then I reached out and gently took his hand. The exact same hand I used to hold when crossing the street. The hand I held during doctor visits, and the hand I squeezed on his very first day of kindergarten. My voice was soft but steady. I love you. The moment those 3 words left my mouth, Ethan completely broke down. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking violently as the tears flowed. He lowered his head and cried, not like a businessman, a husband or a father, but purely like a son realizing exactly how deeply he had wounded his mother. A son realizing how much precious time had been entirely wasted, and realizing that some wounds cannot be simply erased with a sincere apology.
I squeezed his hand gently. But I need time, Ethan.
That honest boundary seemed to impact him deeper than any anger ever could have. Deep down, he understood completely. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. I know. For a few minutes, nobody said a word. Then, unexpectedly, Rachel stood up. She walked around the table and stopped right beside me, her eyes red and her face carrying a heavy look of guilt. A different kind of guilt than Ethan's, but just as real. I'm so sorry too, Gwen. I looked up at her as she wiped away a tear. I should have asked more questions, she said, her voice catching. I believed everything without ever bothering to verify it myself. She looked over at Linda, then turned her gaze back to me. And because of that, I treated you differently. I could see how difficult it was for her to admit that. Unlike Ethan, she hadn't spent a lifetime loving me. She had married into this family and simply inherited a pre-existing narrative, a carefully spun story. But even so, she still had a choice, and she knew it. I gave her a gentle nod. Thank you for saying that, Rachel. She sat back down, and Emily immediately shifted closer to her mother, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. That small gesture felt deeply symbolic. 3 generations of women trying to repair what was broken, trying to find a way back to one another. Then every single eye in the room turned toward Linda. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The sadness and regret vanished, replaced by an intense anticipation. Because there was still one person who hadn't taken responsibility. One person who hadn't explained herself. The person who had spent over a decade carefully shaping the lie. Linda looked completely cornered. For perhaps the first time in her entire life, she had absolutely nowhere to run. No way to deflect attention, no convenient excuses left, and no manipulation tactics available. There were only facts. Documented, verified facts, backed up by Michael's own words. The truth had completely boxed her in. Finally she spoke, her voice sounding smaller than I had ever heard it before. You all don't understand. That single sentence instantly sparked a flash of anger in Ethan. He stood right back up, his voice cracking slightly. No, Aunt Linda. We understand perfectly now. Linda looked completely taken aback. Perhaps she had expected him to defend her, to soften the blow, or to save her from the confrontation. Instead, he looked far more disappointed than angry. And disappointment is often much harder to face. Why? The question came out of him quietly, completely devoid of aggression, just a direct demand for answers. Why did you do this to us? Linda looked around the room, desperately searching for support, a sympathetic glance, or an ally. But she found absolutely nothing. Finally, she let out a long, exhausted sigh. Then something entirely unexpected happened. The fierce defense faded away, the excuses stopped, and for the first time in her life, she actually looked her age. Not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who had been carrying a heavy, toxic secret for entirely too long. I was resentful, she admitted quietly.
Nobody interrupted her.
I was bitter for so many years. Her eyes drifted toward me before quickly looking away. I blamed Gwen. I furrowed my brow in confusion. For what, Linda? She let out a harsh, painful laugh. It was a sound full of regret, as if she herself was embarrassed by the truth of her own answer. For things that weren't even your fault. The room fell entirely still as she continued. Whenever Michael was in trouble, he went to Gwen. Whenever he let people down, Gwen forgave him. Whenever he needed a lifeline, Gwen stayed. I still didn't completely understand where she was going with this. Then Linda said something that caught everyone completely off guard. Nobody ever stayed for me. Those words seemed to hang in the air. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle began to connect. It wasn't a valid excuse, but it was an explanation, and there is a massive difference between the two. What Linda did was completely inexcusable, but for the first time, it was understandable. And sometimes understanding is the first step toward closure.
She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. Michael always put his family first, even when he probably shouldn't have.
And right then, I finally understood. Linda's deep resentment wasn't entirely about the money. It was about comparison. It was about spending a lifetime feeling secondary, less important, less loved, and unchosen. Those toxic feelings had simmered for years, maybe decades, until they turned into something deeply destructive. As the room remained quiet, she kept speaking. After Michael passed away, she swallowed hard. I felt completely abandoned. Nobody responded. Grief can drive people to do terrible things. I started talking. She paused, tears welling in her eyes. And then I just kept talking. Eventually I couldn't stop. That confession felt painfully raw and real. It wasn't the act of a calculated movie villain. It was just a flawed, destructive, and deeply selfish human being.
She looked directly at Ethan, the person she had hurt the most through her deception.
I'm sorry, Ethan. He didn't say a word. She looked over at Rachel. I'm sorry. Still, nothing but silence. Then finally she turned her gaze to me. The woman she had targeted for 12 long years. The woman she had blamed, undermined, and repeatedly hurt. I'm so sorry, Gwen. The room waited in suspense, everyone expecting some grand, dramatic speech or an emotional breakthrough from me. Instead, I simply nodded my head slowly. Because while apologies are incredibly important, they cannot rewrite history. Not instantly, and perhaps never completely. What they can do is provide a starting point, and sometimes that has to be enough. The meeting continued for a few more hours. Questions were asked, documents were thoroughly reviewed, the timeline was clarified, and the false stories were finally corrected. For the first time in over a decade, everyone in the family was operating on the exact same version of reality. That single afternoon changed everything, not miraculously or instantly, but deeply. As night fell, everyone slowly began to prepare to leave. The emotional exhaustion visible on every single face, especially Ethan's. Before walking out the door, he approached me one last time. This time, he stood tall, like an adult, like a son trying to rebuild something precious. I'll wait, he said quietly. I looked up at him. Wait for what? However long it takes. His eyes welled up again. I'll wait for your forgiveness. Their response caught me completely by surprise. It wasn't dramatic. It was incredibly mature. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't demanding my understanding. He was offering his patience. And that gave me a genuine sense of hope, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I stood alone on the front porch. The rain had stopped completely. The clouds were breaking apart, and the first moonlight was breaking through the horizon. For the first time in 12 years, I felt a profound sense of lightness. I wasn't fully healed, and the story wasn't completely over, but the crushing weight was gone. The truth was finally out in the open. And now, perhaps, our family could begin the difficult, necessary work of truly becoming a family again. The weeks following that family meeting were some of the strangest of my entire life. For years, I had constantly worried about what would happen if the truth ever came out. I had anticipated screaming matches, permanent resentment, and a complete fracturing of the family. I had never once expected a quiet, respectful silence. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was the kind of stillness that happens after a massive storm, when everyone is standing back to assess the damage. For the first few days, Ethan didn't call, and honestly, I was deeply grateful for the space. It wasn't because I didn't love him, but because we both needed time to breathe. 12 years of emotional pain do not vanish over a single weekend, no matter how sincere the apologies are or how shocking the revelations were. Healing requires room to breathe. For the first time in over a decade, I actually allowed myself to have that room. I stopped constantly worrying about everyone else.
stopped carrying their heavy emotions, and stopped trying to fix problems that I hadn't created. Slowly, I began to focus entirely on myself.
One morning I went for a simple walk in a nearby park. The sun was shining, birds were singing in the distance, and children were playing. Yet somehow it felt completely extraordinary, because I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd gone for a walk without carrying the suffocating weight of a massive secret. The burden hadn't disappeared completely, but it had become significantly lighter. 3 days after the meeting, a letter arrived in the mail. I recognized Ethan's handwriting instantly, and my stomach tightened slightly. I stared at the envelope for a few minutes before finally opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, spanning 5 full pages. The very first sentence nearly brought me to tears. "Oh, Mum, for the first time in my life, I honestly don't know how to begin." I sat down at the kitchen table and kept reading. The letter wasn't a defense of his actions, it wasn't self-serving, and it was entirely free of excuses. In fact, that was what touched me the deepest. Ethan wasn't trying to explain away his behavior, he was genuinely trying to understand it. Page after page, he reflected on his past actions, his assumptions, his pride, and his failures. One paragraph in particular stayed with me. "I spent years fully believing I knew exactly who you were. The truth is, I spent years listening to other people's stories about you instead of actually listening to you." Another line cut straight to the heart. "I made you pay the price for sacrifices I never even knew you were making. I blamed you for protecting me, and I punished you simply because you loved our family." By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the letter was completely, painfully real. For the first time in a decade, I felt like Ethan was speaking directly to me, completely free of anyone else's toxic influence. The following week, another letter arrived, then another and another. Each one was thoughtful, sincere, and deeply reflective. Not once did he beg for immediate forgiveness. Not once did he pressure me for a response, and he never made the letters about his own emotional needs. Instead, he focused entirely on taking accountability. And true accountability is incredibly rare, especially when it comes with a heavy dose of personal pain. At the same time, something else entirely unexpected began to happen. Rachel started reaching out to me as well. It wasn't frequent or aggressive, just a gentle, steady effort. A text message asking how my week was going, a photo of Emily, or a simple kind greeting. At first, my responses were cautious. Years of emotional distance don't dissolve overnight. But gradually, I felt a shift. Rachel was no longer operating on old assumptions. She was actively trying to build a real relationship based on reality. And that meant the world to me. One Saturday afternoon, Emily came over to visit me completely on her own. The moment she walked through the door, she wrapped me in a massive hug, held on for a long moment, and smiled up at me. "I missed you, Grandma." Her simple, unfiltered honesty made me smile. "I missed you too, sweetheart." We spent hours together, baking cookies, talking, and looking through old family videos. Eventually, she asked the one question I knew was coming. "Grandma, are you doing okay?" The genuine concern in her voice was incredibly moving. She wasn't asking out of nosiness or a desire for drama. She truly cared about my well-being.
I thought about my answer carefully, and then I smiled at her.
"I think I'm getting there, Emily." She nodded slowly, as if she understood completely. And perhaps she did, far better than most. Before she left that evening, she said something I'll never forget. "You know, Dad cries a lot these days," she said quietly. I gave a soft laugh. "Really?" She nodded seriously. "More than I've ever seen him cry in my entire life." Her expression turned solemn. "He really loves you, Grandma." Long after she left, those words kept echoing in my mind, because despite everything we had been through, I knew they were absolutely true. Love had never been the problem in our family. Fear was the problem. Pride was the problem. Silence, secrets, and lies were the problems. But love never was. It had simply been buried underneath everything else. A month after the family meeting, another unexpected development occurred. Linda called me. At first, I seriously considered letting it go to voicemail. A part of me wanted to avoid her entirely, but ultimately, I decided to pick up. The conversation was incredibly awkward. and neither of us quite knew how to begin. Finally, Linda broke the ice. "I started going to therapy," she said quietly. That admission completely shocked me. Not because therapy is unusual, but because admitting it requires a massive amount of humility. And humility had never been Linda's strong suit. "I should have done this years ago," she continued. I remained quiet and simply listened. For nearly an hour, she just talked. She wasn't trying to justify her past actions. She was trying to understand her own loneliness, resentment, jealousy, and grief. None of it excused what she had done, but understanding is a powerful thing. It is often the very first step toward ensuring history doesn't repeat itself. By the time the call ended, I felt an unexpected wave of peace. We weren't fully reconciled, and the damage wasn't magically undone, but the air was clear. A few days later, Robert came over to visit. We sat on the back porch drinking coffee, watching the cool autumn air turn the leaves into vibrant shades of amber and gold. For a while, we just sat in comfortable silence. Then he looked over at me and smiled. "You look different, Gwen." I laughed a little. "Older?" "No." He shook his head. "Lighter." Lighter. That was the exact word I had been thinking about for weeks. Lighter. Not because my life had suddenly become perfect, but because I was finally only carrying my own weight instead of trying to carry the emotional baggage of everyone else. Robert paused, then asked, "Have you heard from Ethan recently?" I nodded. "Every week." I looked out at the trees, reflecting on the progress we had made. "He's really putting in the effort." Robert smiled warmly. "Good." He paused for a moment before adding a thought that stayed with me forever. "Sometimes that's all a person can do, Gwen. Try. You can't erase the past, undo old mistakes, or rewrite history. You can only try to do better today. And perhaps that is more than enough." Later that evening, when I walked back inside, I found another letter waiting for me in the mailbox. I recognized Ethan's handwriting immediately. I opened it right away. It was a brief note, much shorter than his previous ones, but every single word carried immense weight. At the very bottom was a simple invitation. "If you're ready, I would really love to see you. No pressure and no expectations. Just a simple lunch. Just a mother and her son. Whenever you're ready." I stared at those words for a long time, and then I carefully folded the paper. Because for the first time since this entire journey began, I realized something wonderful. I was finally ready. The restaurant Ethan chose was a small, quiet place right by the river, about a 40-minute drive from my house. It wasn't fancy or expensive, just a peaceful spot with a beautiful view. When I arrived, he was already there waiting for me. I could tell how incredibly nervous he was from across the room. The moment he saw me walk in, he stood up instantly. It was the exact way Michael used to stand up whenever I entered a room. The sudden realization caught me completely off guard. For a split second, I saw his father's shadow in him. Not the mistakes, not the struggles, but the genuine kindness, gentleness, and humanity. Life has a strange way of doing that. Sometimes the negative traits we fear inheriting vanish, while the beautiful qualities we had forgotten somehow find a way to survive. "Hi, Mum," he said, his voice soft and incredibly cautious. "Hi, Ethan." For a brief second, neither of us knew quite what to do. Then we embraced. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic hug, filled with tears and a breakdown. It was just a simple, grounding hug between a mother and her son. But given everything we had survived to get to this moment, it felt incredibly significant. We took our seats, and the waitress brought over our menus. Neither of us even glanced at them. We were both entirely too distracted. Finally, Ethan let out a nervous laugh. "I don't think I'm actually hungry," he admitted. I smiled. To be honest, neither am I. With that, the tension in the air began to ease. For the first time in years, being together didn't feel like an uphill battle. It actually felt like a fresh start. For the first few minutes, we stuck to safe, easy topics. The weather, how Emily was doing in school, and work. It allowed us to find our footing. But eventually, the conversation naturally drifted toward the subject we both knew we needed to face. Ethan stared out at the river, then turned his gaze back to me. "I can't stop thinking about all those years I got it wrong," he said, a deep sadness in his voice. I didn't interrupt him. "I keep replaying the old conversations in my mind," he paused, swallowing hard. "The family dinners, the phone calls, the awful things I said to you.
I could see the deep pain in his eyes, a genuine, honest remorse, completely free of self-pity. And remorse can be one of the heaviest burdens a person can ever carry.
I wish more than anything I could change it. His voice cracked slightly. I know you do, Ethan.
He stared down at the table for a moment, then asked a question I completely didn't expect.
Are you angry with Dad? The honesty of the question caught me off guard. I took a moment to really think about it before responding. Sometimes, I answered truthfully. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. But not all the time, I added softly. He looked at me with genuine curiosity. How so? I gave him a gentle smile. Because people are never just one thing, Ethan. He listened quietly as I continued. Your father hurt me deeply. He lied, he made terrible financial decisions, and he created problems that affected our entire family. Ethan nodded in agreement. But he also loved us very much, I said, letting the words resonate. He wasn't a monster. He was simply a deeply flawed man who spent years making mistakes, and in the end, he knew it too. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment before nodding. I think that's been the hardest part for me to accept. What part? Realizing that people aren't just black and white. They aren't pure heroes or pure villains. I smiled warmly. He finally understood. Truly understood. That was one of the greatest lessons hidden within our family's painful history. Life is incredibly complex. People are complex. And the truth is really simple. Our food finally arrived, and though neither of us had much of an appetite, we ate and talked. Really talked for the first time in so many years. We shared happy childhood memories, talked openly about Michael, discussed our mistakes, and spoke about the path to healing.
At one point, Ethan looked me dead in the eye. I'm not demanding your forgiveness, Mom. I hope to earn it someday, but I will never demand it.
I studied his face closely. The humility in his voice was entirely real, not a performance or a strategy. It was completely genuine. And right then, I realized something powerful. For months, Ethan had been showing me that exact same consistency through his letters, his actions, and his immense patience. He hadn't demanded a single thing from me. He hadn't rushed my healing process, and he hadn't offered a single excuse. He simply kept showing up, time and time, alone. And that consistency mattered far more than any spoken apology ever could. Because true change isn't measured by the words we say. It is measured by the things we do. Our lunch lasted for nearly 3 hours, and when we finally stood up to leave, neither of us seemed to want the afternoon to end. That felt like real, undeniable progress. Before heading to our separate cars, Ethan stopped in the middle of the riverside parking lot. Underneath a clear autumn sky, he looked at me. Mom. Yes, Ethan. I love you. Hearing those words hit me far deeper than I ever could have anticipated. For over a decade, that love had been buried under layers of manipulation, misunderstanding, and silence. Now it stood entirely on its own. Clear, honest, and completely uncomplicated. I smiled through my tears. I love you too, Ethan. For the first time in a very long time, those words felt completely whole, completely unmarred by the past. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving arrived. The irony of the holiday wasn't lost on me. Family gatherings had historically been the setting for some of the most painful moments of my entire life. But this year felt entirely different. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The moment I arrived at Ethan and Rachel's house, Emily practically tackled me with a massive hug. Rachel welcomed me with genuine warmth, and Robert was already there smiling. Even Linda attended, though an understandable, respectful distance remained between us. True healing doesn't instantly erase the consequences of the past, but it creates a beautiful opportunity for something new. The holiday dinner was noticeably quieter than in previous years. More reflective, thoughtful, and deeply honest. Nobody was pretending anymore. Nobody was putting on a performance, and nobody was fighting to maintain a false illusion. Somehow that made the entire evening feel incredibly authentic. At one point during dinner, Emily stood up and raised her glass. Everyone turned to look at her as she smiled brightly. I just want to say something, she announced. Rachel laughed softly. Oh boy. Emily playfully ignored her mother. I think this is officially the very first family dinner where every single person is actually telling the truth. The entire table burst into startled laughter, and I couldn't help but laugh along with them, because she was absolutely right. Then Emily looked directly at me. "I'm just so incredibly happy you're here, Grandma." A wave of warmth filled my entire chest. "I'm so happy to be here too, sweetheart." The rest of the evening passed in complete tranquility, devoid of drama, imperfect, but profoundly peaceful. And honestly, that was all I could ever ask for. Later that night, after returning to my own home, I sat alone on my back porch. The exact same porch where I had wept bitter tears years ago. The porch where I had questioned everything and fully believed my family was broken beyond repair. The night wind was cool, and the stars above were remarkably clear. For the first time in 12 long years, I felt a deep, genuine sense of absolute peace. It wasn't because everyone had offered a perfect apology. It wasn't because every single relationship was completely restored. And it wasn't because the past had magically vanished. The past never truly goes away. I felt at peace simply because the truth was finally out in the open. For years I had lived in absolute terror that speaking the truth would destroy my family. I was completely wrong. It was the lies that had nearly ruined us, and it was the truth that ultimately saved us. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't painless, but it saved us nonetheless, because the truth gives people the power to choose, to understand, to grow, and to truly heal. As I sat there under the starlit sky, reflecting on this entire journey, I realized the single most important lesson of all. The most dangerous burden you can ever carry isn't the truth. It is carrying a lie for so long that everyone completely forgets what reality even looks like. That weight nearly crushed me, but it never will again. My name is Gwen Sullivan. After 12 years of silence, I finally shared the truth with the people I love. It cost me more than words can ever describe, but in the end, it gave me back something infinitely more valuable: my family. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the exact ones capable of hurting us the deepest. Not because they are inherently malicious, and not because they don't care, but simply because they fell hook, line, and sinker for a story that was never true to begin with. One of the most painful lessons I had to learn throughout this experience is that silence always carries a heavy price tag. We often choose to stay silent out of a desperate desire to protect the people around us. We hide our pain to maintain an illusion of peace, and we carry crushing burdens alone because we truly believe we are doing the right thing. But when our silence allows a lie to grow and thrive, it stops being a form of protection. It becomes a prison. For over a decade, I fully believed I was protecting my late husband's memory and shielding my son from immense pain. What I failed to realize was that every secret we keep leaves a blank space for someone else to write their own version of the narrative. And eventually, they will. Another vital lesson is that forgiveness and complete reconciliation do not happen instantly. Forgiveness is a long journey. Rebuilding trust is a journey. And true healing takes time. None of it happens overnight. A person who genuinely regrets their past actions won't just offer an apology. They will change their behavior, take real accountability, and show immense patience while slowly rebuilding that shattered trust. That is what true growth looks like. Above all else, please remember this. The truth can hurt, it can be deeply uncomfortable, and it can completely break your heart. But the truth is also the only thing capable of creating a real opportunity for healing. A lie can only ever create a temporary, fragile peace. Only the truth can build a peace that lasts a lifetime. If this story resonated with you, I would truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been deeply misunderstood by the people you love the most? Have you ever kept a massive secret out of a desire to protect someone else? Do you believe Gwen made the right choice by staying silent for 12 long years? Please feel free to share your own experiences and journeys. Your story might be the exact thing someone else needs to read today to realize they are not alone. And if you connect with stories about family, true resilience, emotional justice, and healing, please remember to subscribe and join our community for more journeys just like this one. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this moment with me.